So this whole part about contested vision and how different groups might be looking at it comes into play for Charles Goodwin when he's looking at the Rodney King beating and the trial that happened for the 4 officers who were then later acquitted. He was looking at how is it that you can have the public, there was public outcry with the Rodney King trial and the Rodney King beating and then the acquittal of those officers. And people, the general public, couldn't understand how come these 4 officers were acquitted. It was plain as day what had happened. We had a video. So how could anybody contest the vision that was clear as day on that video? That is a very interesting question, which is what is really going on here with vision? What is really going on here with perception? If something that appears clear as day to one group is not clear as day to another, you've got a research question. And that's really what Charles Goodwin was looking at. Is like, how can we describe, how can we understand what was going on in that courtroom? All right, so these 3 practices are at work in the King trial. They help us understand how the radically different view of the defense and that the jury followed in the end was produced, namely by changing their perception, which led to the acquittal of the 4 officers. They were put on trial, these 4 officers, after the tape was broadcast on television and that there was public outrage, and they were put on trial for the, quote, excessive use of force. That's what they were put on trial for. The principal piece of evidence against them was the tape. The violence it showed was so graphic that many people assumed that a conviction was going to be automatic. But then the jury found them innocent, which then triggered what is called the LA Riots of 1992. And then at a second federal trial, a year later, 2 of the 4 officers were convicted of violating King's rights. But how come they weren't convicted the first time? Contested vision. All right, some background. Okay, the Los Angeles Riots, as they're called, sprung from years of rising tensions between the LAPD and the city's African-American population, highlighted by the 1991 videotaped beating of Rodney King. This is his face after the beating. I mean, of course, there's damage all over his body. All right. Now, he was a motorist who was stopped for speeding by 4 white police officers. On April 29th, 1992, anger boiled over after the officers were found not guilty of assaulting King and using excessive force, which led to several days of widespread violence, looting, and arson throughout Los Angeles. And by May 3rd, thousands of National Guardsmen and federal troops had largely curbed what was going on in LA at the time. And then at the end, you got May 3rd, when it ended, there were 53 deaths noted, a little over 2,300 injuries, 7,000 fires, and damage to about 3,100 businesses, and about nearly $1 billion lost in financial losses. This is what the city looked like. Okay. So what we're going to watch next would be a History Channel video that kind of encapsulates a lot of the context of what was going on in the early 90s and the 80s, and a little bit before that as well. All right, take a look.
The 92 Los Angeles riots can really be traced back to the period after the end of the civil rights movement, when tension between African American communities and the police simmered in American cities all across the country.
This is where the fuse was lighted. It began with the arrest by white officers of the California Highway Patrol of 2 young Negroes.
A young African American man named Marquette Fry was pulled over by a CHP officer who directed him to pull off into Watts, which he did. But things escalated and a crowd began to gather. The officer hustled Marquette Fry into a cruiser and took off. Suddenly, this exploded into something Los Angeles had never seen. A major multi-day civil disorder.
After 6 days of these events, 34 people are dead. There are over 1,000 injuries, 3,500 people are arrested, and there's at least $40 million property damage.
When you look at Marquette Fry, it wasn't that one incident. It was just a repeated brutality that everybody had been a victim of.
Tom Bradley, a former LAPD lieutenant and city council member, made history in 1973 when he was elected the first African-American mayor of a major American city with a white majority.
The unemployment rate among Black adults is double the average and climbing.
All this was in the air when the position of chief of police opened up and Tom Bradley selected Daryl Gates to be the chief.
Gerald, this is your day.
Gerald Gates was the American police officer's chief. He was the right guy at the right time. He was military in his approach and very adamant about making sure that police officers would be able to do what they needed to do to protect the community.
LAPD's militarized approach in the 1980s leave Black communities feeling less protected by law enforcement and more like living in an occupied territory.
Fast forward the early 90s, things are already tense. You got police harassment, police brutality, unemployment is through the roof. The Rodney King Beating had just taken place, and then all of a sudden you hear the story. There was a young African-American girl, teenager, who was killed by a Korean merchant over a bottle of orange juice. No one believes that.
The shooting has outraged the Black community. It was the fifth involving African and Korean Americans in Los Angeles.
Latasha Hollins got shot 13 days after Rodney King beating. So we're talking about within 2 weeks, we have Rodney King beating and Latasha Hollins shooting.
It was clearly a murder. The child was killed in cold blood. So we're dealing with the Latasha Harlins case. And during this time, the Rodney King trials would have a powder keg waiting to explode.
Okay. So there's some extra context there for those of you who didn't know.